Also, Ghazal, I wanted to say the next volume of our architectural journal here at the National University is going to be dedicated to alternative representation practices. So I already told the editor that we should have you somehow, either by transcribing today's presentation or through an interview or through a text that you might want to share and I could translate. So we are very happy. It's a very timely moment to have you, and we are honored to listen to you sharing your work with us. So
thanks, Daniel. Yeah, I think it's a great idea. So let's talk about it. We definitely have something for you, especially when it comes to translation, since it's like it's always been a kind of part of the agenda of the team to translate part of the project into Spanish. I think it's a great opportunity. So let's more on this. Let's continue.
Fantastic. So let me get started. Now that we are recording, I just want to welcome everyone. This is part of our lecture series at our thesis seminar at the Faculty of Architecture at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Ghazal is our first international speaker this semester. I'm going to introduce her. Dr. Ghazal Jafari is a territorial scholar, a weaver, and an educator, professionally trained as an architect and urban designer. Originally of Persian and Azeri descent and currently living in voluntary exile in the United States, Dr. Jafari left Iran due to political and socio-environmental violence. Her research focuses on spatial and environmental justice, landscape infrastructure, plant knowledge, feminist liberation, immigrants' narrative, and non-Western spatial discourses. Her teaching engages urban ecologies, contingency planning for climate change and geopolitical conflict, and politics of representation. She's a founding director of Open Systems, a non-profit 501c3 organization dedicated to opening knowledge of complex ecological challenges and raising awareness about geopolitical conflicts at the intersection of spatial inequality, climate justice, and community self-determination. Her coming book is about clashing histories of the transnational systems of dispossession and struggles for survival along the Iran-Iraq borderlands. As part of her book, Ghazal has been mapping the interdependencies between the ecological richness and endurance of riverine landscapes, matriarchal organizations, and resurgent feminist ecologies to reveal the subversive trajectories and prospects of transgenerational emancipatory struggles in waters and plants past, present, and future. Her recent projects and publications include Towards a Flora of the Future, A Botany of Violence, Not Your Amazon to Exploit, No Design on Stolen Land, Confronting Columbus, and New Geographies 9, Post-Human. She's an assistant professor of urban and environmental planning at the University of Virginia's School of Architecture. With that, we welcome you, Ghazal. Thank you so much. And the stage is all yours.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to be able to share some thoughts. It's nice to meet you, Armando. I'm connecting with you today from Charlottesville, Central Virginia, the traditional land of the Monacan Indian Nation. And a lot of work that I've been doing, maybe I should first share my screen with you. So let me do that first. Share screen. Share sound, just in case. So a lot of work that I'll be sharing with you today is basically shaped around collaboration with like-minded colleagues at Open Systems. That's a nonprofit organization, and we've been kind of working in the past few days on a series of public demonstrations and multimedia projects that intersect environmental justice, political self-determination, and kind of dealing with the condition of geopolitical conflict. I need to move you up there to be able to see my slides. Okay, perfect. So I wanted to start with a quote from Edward Said. For those of you who are not familiar with Edward Said, he's a Palestinian kind of cultural historian and political activist who's been writing extensively about Orientalism and basically the Western representation of the people living in the Orient, in the East, and kind of explaining the mentality behind shaping and representation or invention of the third world in Western imagination. And he's also known as father of post-colonialism. His entire life project, one way or another, was kind of concerned with the question of representation and politics of representation. In this interesting piece, the kind of transcription of an interview that is called "In the Shadow of the West," published in 1985, he says, "The act of representation, hence reducing of others, almost always involves violence of some sort. Whether you call it a spectacular image or an exotic image or a scholarly representation, there's always this paradoxical contrast between the surface, which seems to be in control, and the process which produces it, which inevitably involves some degree of violence, decontextualization, miniaturization, etc. The action or process of representation implies control. It implies accumulation. It implies confinement. It implies a certain kind of estrangement or disorientation on the part of the one representing. What we must eliminate are systems of representation that carry with them the kind of authority which has been repressive because it does not permit or make room for intervention on the part of those represented." So with this introduction, a lot of work that we've been doing, including the book that I would like to briefly share with you today, can be counted as political projects of counter-representation, and then trying to push back against a series of taken for granted oppressive narratives. This book was a pandemic project. And basically, I had the privilege of working with Dr. Pierre Belanger and our colleague Pablo Scudero, who's Ecuadorian mestizo. And he was collaborating with us at a time, and he was a stock in Ecuador. So he was our kind of field agent and photographer in a way. The project, in a way, was instigated by one event and one map. So in this image by photojournalist David Diaz, you can see the indigenous-led uprising, this kind of moment that is that captures the indigenous-led uprising on October 12, 2019, in the city of Quito, the capital city of Ecuador. In response to it, or to protest the sanctions from the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and austerity measures that were imposed overnight by then Ecuadorian President Lenin Moreno. Here you can see the statue of Isabella Católica that was built in 1990 with support of the white and mestizo middle class in Quito, covered in red paint. And for those of you who are not familiar with this character, Isabella Católica was Queen of Spain, and who basically funded the voyage of Christopher Columbus to America back in 1492. And the red paint kind of symbolizes the history of indigenous resistance. In woman's hand, you can see the ceremonial concha, and basically the picture, the portrait of Dolores Cucango, who was born in 1881, and he is a radical feminist organizer and indigenous warrior from the Andes, who lived through most of the 20th century to kind of see, lead, and inspire revolutionary challenges led by indigenous women and tribal nations against settler colonialism. So this was all of a sudden kind of bringing all of that history together, kind of signifying that this is not one isolated event, but this has been a continuous kind of history that deserves unpacking. And the map that I was talking about is basically the Alexander von Humboldt's famous map that is known as a physical tableau of equatorial region that accompanied his essay on the geography of plants, published in 1803. And this map is a really famous one because, Alexander von Humboldt is known as father of modern environmentalism, and this map is constantly circulated within architectural environments. But barely, if at all, anyone bothers to read the map, and we did not really understand what it was containing until we found a very high resolution image, and we started zooming in and kind of started reading the name of these plants. And then we realized that basically in the middle of the map, there's a region where he was kind of indexing different species, different varieties of the cinchona plant. And some of them have been mapped before by other naturalists, such as La Condamine. And basically it became clear to us that marked in the mid-altitudes of the Andes, this section of the Chimborazo mountain that is close to Quito, Ecuador, is basically a treasure map. In a way, is a map that can become a guide for kind of future naturalists / explorers, directing them to show where they can find this particular tree. So what is the cinchona tree? Why was it so kind of significant? Cinchona tree was known as the only, and it is known today as the only natural cure for malaria that is containing, its bark contains a alkaloid known as quinine, which is the cure. And under claims of naturalists and conservationists, the colonial exploration for cinchona and botanical charting of the tropical Ecuador becomes a cover, in a way, for imperial propaganda, economic profiteering, counterfeiting, and commercial defrauding over the past few centuries. There was a lot of mistakes and myths and misunderstandings surrounding this plant, all the way even to the name. So it was referred to as the cinchona, the chinchona, the quina, Jesuits bark, Peruvian bark. And a lot of this nomenclature is based on misunderstandings and kind of, they have European origin, not necessarily referring to the original name that was given to the plant by the natives. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples of Quechua nations through the Central Andes have cared for, cultivated, and nurtured the medicinal knowledge of quinine and the geographic intelligence of the cinchona plant by respecting and honoring its sovereignty. So the original home of this plant has been the Loja region, which is now located in southern Ecuador in the borderland between Peru and Ecuador. My computer is thinking. The next image is a little bit heavy. Okay, there we go. So we started mapping the atrocities of the past 500 years in this non-linear visual timeline. Can you hear me well?
Yes, Ghazal, we can hear you. We can hear you.
I heard some noise, so I thought maybe like the connection isn't well. Okay, so we started mapping the history of atrocities over the past 500 years in this non-linear visual timeline that includes more than 300 images. So it turned out to be a archival activism in a way during the pandemic time. This timeline shows overharvesting, industrial lodging, deforestation, missionary expeditions, infrastructural development, road building, pipeline corridors, land seizures, minings, and other forms and operations of extraction as they were intersecting with development of the knowledge of botany and the story of the cinchona plant. So the botanical history of violence shaped around this plant is tied to the continuity of colonialism and emergence of capitalist economies in the North, the so-called malaria-free states, Europe and the United States. Here, the science of botany and natural conservation emerge as weapons of colonialism. In the next few pages, I was hoping that I can go through the book and show you just a little bit of some entries and some of the facts, because, you know, it's, even though it's easy to kind of talk about the main kind of takeaways from this timeline, I think the significance of doing projects as such is always in paying attention to detail and reading the documents and seeing the images in detail. So the first layer of the timeline is the story of the cinchona plant and how it was deterritorialized, taken out of the region between the 17th and 19th century by the Jesuits, the Spanish botanists, and the British plantsmen, how contraband seeds were stolen and sacred knowledge of the plant's healing power was weaponized against indigenous people in the Andes and other places. The first traces of European extraction and monopoly over the plant is recorded to be by the Society of Jesuits, a missionary mandate following the 1638 papal bull, basically the act that was signed by the Pope at the time. And so the Jesuits pursued their civilizing mission in the South America following that papal bull. So here Christian ideology becomes a weapon in order to access, assimilate, and extract resources from the land, in this case, the cinchona tree. This, of course, has always been associated and based on kind of territorial disposition and military penetrations to the region. This map shows basically the occupation of the Andean Amazon by the Spanish soldiers and so-called explorers, and the establishment of Quito as the center of the empire, the capital of the empire. It was also associated with kind of naturalized representations of the land and people in South America and Central America. And that was possible because of territorial penetrations of explorers, starting with Christopher Columbus, and genocide of people, as well as survey missions, which basically meant systemic exploration and appropriation of geographic, anthropological, and indigenous knowledge about medicinal plants commissioned by the Spanish crown. Starting from the mid-17th century, competition for finding the tree and rush to Loja region begins here. As we see, all of a sudden there is an order by the king for preservation of the bark as a matter of kind of security and continuation of the empire. And then that leads to basically the first sponsors of the science of botany and taxonomical survey of the Andes was the Spanish crown. In mid-1700s, there are new institutions mobilized the natural science at large, from geology and mineralogy to botany and zoology across the landscape of the looted foods and colonial trophies. Everything that was stolen and looted was then kind of displayed in exhibition halls and entire buildings, and even the gardens. This particular image is showing the Royal Botanical Garden in Madrid that was built in 1772. There was also anxiety about preservation of the seed of the plant, which led to the 1768 establishment of royal pharmacy. And you can consider this as the first access to botanical data restored in form of a seed. Here we can see separation of the seed from the region and from the culture, and breaking the cultural code of honor and respect for the plant. This was also a precursor to kind of reducing the plant into its DNA and turning it into kind of a subject of intellectual property right, which was then formalized in 1940s with a kind of IP, or intellectual property, becoming a new form of property regime that corporations kind of used extensively. It was with the decline of kind of, let's just say, the over harvesting of this plant from the Loha region led to kind of the need for creation of plantation and transplantation of the tree. The plantation happened in, again, the Amazonian Andes and the Loha region, where the forests were cut clean and replaced by cinchona plantations, which had devastating ecological and humanitarian implications. But then it also led to transplantation around the world across the equator line or the tropical regions, right? And that kind of coincided with the scramble for Africa in the decline of kind of European power. They kind of shifted their gaze towards Africa, and malaria in Africa was becoming a very serious issue. By this time, the plant was already smuggled by a British trader, and which then opened the access to the bark to the British and Dutch players. So it was not just a monopoly of the Spanish monarchy. And here you see that basically cinchona becomes not only important for saving the declining Europe, but its colonial expansion in Africa. And there are really, as we were reading documents with regards to this, it came to our attention that there are kind of racial connotations when it comes to kind of talking about malaria in Africa. So just to give you an example, the India-born British-trained physician Ronald Russ said, no wild deserts, no savage race, no geographical difficulties have proved so inimical to civilization as this disease. We may almost say that it has withheld the entire continent from humanity, the immense and fertile tracts of Africa that we call the Dark Continent should be called the malarious continent. So basically, you can see that they're kind of equating savagery and backwardness with presence of this disease, but at the same time, they're recognizing or like claiming that for us to be able to continue with our civilizing mission, we need to overcome this disease. And that therefore, all of a sudden, the competition over the market of quinine and the cinchona plant becomes a matter of the civilizing mission and humanitarian kind of goals of the white man's burden in a way. And here's when you see basically when the cinchona plant is kind of being tested on a growing steadily controlled environment of like greenhouses such as Kew Garden, kind of result in it lead to dissociation of plant production from its original place, which was the Loha region. And then all of a sudden transplantation happens around the equator line, starting from West Bengal in the mid 1800s, and then southern India, and then in the footsteps of the Dutch East India Company in West Java. So this process of transplantation around the world continues to the 20th century and is always kind of followed by, I mean, we can say slave labor and deforestation, erosion of the land, and kind of territorial injustices that ensued. This, of course, continues to this very day in Congo. So that's what I wanted to mention, that it's like this regime of exploitation constantly reproduces new frontiers and continues to this very day. So the Democratic Republic of Congo is incredibly important in the story of Cinchona because right now the largest quinine producer in the world, that is a German company named Pharmakina, is based out of this eastern part of DCR in the province of Kivu. And basically geographically, this area is important because it is still kind of suffering the hangover of colonial atrocities and the Belgian colonialism, incredibly brutal history, but it's also signifying another important event. The Dutch Kina Bureau, which was once a kind of place in Indonesia and West Java, set up a shop here with the French partner after labor strikes and major disagreements emerged under plantation in Indonesia after Indonesia gained independence in 1949. So you see that this kind of labor abuse and practice of exploitation is constantly traveling and finding new geographies. And of course, it's not coincidental when you pay close attention to these images, you see that the majority of, I would say, like either extremely cheapened or slave labor are women and children. We can talk about that later. But then, you know, it's like there is a lot about the history of Cinchona that I jumped over, including, for instance, like the discovery of the chemical compound, which then leads to monopoly over its production by corporation companies, the kind of production of the synthetic version of it in mid-20th century by the Americans. But then by 1990s and 2000s, it becomes clear that wild mosquitoes mutate too. So the earlier versions of the drug, the medicine, were no longer effective when it came to because of new types of malaria. And so all of a sudden you see this renewed kind of rush to rediscover alternatives or like better species that can effectively that can be more effective, at this time by scientists. And so this like scientists now emerge as new missionaries. Here you can see a film, a snapshot of a film, and basically Dr. Nina Ronstedt is, as she's kind of handing the plant to the carrier, she's saying that guard it with your life. There are things out there that have not been discovered yet, and that should be really alarming for people that think like this kind of histories of exploitation, colonialism, or facts of past. No, they're continuous. And this is happening when we consider the majority of worst cases of malaria being in like the economically deprived countries in tropical regions, including Ecuador. But, you know, it's like once the plant and the knowledge was extracted from the region, once the indigenous territories have been kind of occupied and people have been displaced from these territories, they have lost their kind of traditional knowledge, and they've been going through this like collective forgetfulness when it comes to their medicinal knowledge. And now they have to kind of line up behind dispensaries to buy this cure from pharmaceuticals. So the story of Cinchona also interacts with a lot of other histories. One would be representation of the region. This image is a painting by Edwin Church, 1859. It's called Heart of the Andes, and he was really kind of inspired by Humboldt's explorations. He goes there and tries to kind of paint the Chimborazo mountain again. Here you can see the romanticized nature in style of the Hudson River School of Painting that had a major role in romanticizing fictional romanticization of the American frontier for settlers. And this image was hung in U.S. Sanitary Commission Metropolitan Fair in 1859, and it's now currently in Met Museum. When it was hung there, I think this image is important because you see it is hung under the images of three American presidents, and that kind of is really telling. It's really telling that United States was kind of shifting its gaze towards the South and kind of considering South America as its own kind of extended frontier or its backyard. And I skipped over the role of Americans in this history, but they're major players, especially during the 20th century, whether in production of the synthetic version or during the World War II and kind of spraying the entire region with DDT to combat malaria, and then moving to the Cold War, kind of combating communism through guerrilla militants under the name of under the banner of war on drugs in 1970s and 1980s. All of this is happening when simultaneously the kind of conservation in a way becomes a more established arm within the capitalist economic system, in a sense that kind of it captures particular territories as part of world heritage. And here we can see the Galapagos Island becomes the first World Heritage, in a way imaging the mirror of national park systems in the United States, following the Conference on Environment at UNESCO in 1971. And of course, we can talk about geospatial organization of empire and colonial relations. This image shows the grid of Quito, Ecuador, that was kind of superimposed by the metropolitan project of the Spanish Empire in 1784. After establishment of the states, exploitation of indigenous territories continued in other ways. This map shows the establishment of nation states following the 1820 Madrid Treaty and formation of nation states, which led to some territorial conflicts as a result. One of those exploitations, methods of exploitation that I mentioned is, for instance, the establishment of national water law as part of the effort of the militarized state to claim sovereignty over land, water, and subsoil, and prioritizing water support for city centers at the expense of rural farmers, which led to massive displacement. These images are showing the port of Guayaquil that was kind of built and put together as a port export, as a port and kind of point of export of the Cinchona plant to Europe. And basically, as a result of those kind of nationalization of water, more than 1,500 rural indigenous farmers have been deprived of the traditional waters in the upper valleys of the river, And basically they had to move to the outskirts of Guayaquil and kind of reside in these areas that United Nations mislabel as a slum. Exploitation also continues through massive infrastructural projects, including, for instance, Trans-Amazonica Highway, built in 1970s to support the transnational trade across the Amazonian region. Here you can see the map of it kind of crossing under and over the waterways and tributaries, and kind of also at the same time indicating the kind of the blueprint for extension of urbanization along this corridor. And the project continues to this very day, despite now understanding that the part of this territory that the road is kind of disturbing is an incredibly fragile and most fragile ecosystems, and one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. We can talk about also extraction. This map shows the trans-Ecuadorian oil pipeline that was built by Texaco, and there has been a massive court case and a lot of battle between indigenous peoples of Ecuador and Texaco, because they've been basically polluting all the waterways in the past 20 years and covering it up, and not necessarily kind of taking responsibility for what they've been doing, kind of polluting the source of water for like thousands of people and millions of other species. And of course, the assault on indigenous territories continues in many different ways. These are things that you've seen in the news, whether it's through lodging or purposeful burning of forests and clearing of the land, continues to this day. Another layer of this timeline was concerned with revealing gender violence. From the very beginning, we see that there's disproportionate violence applied against women, and that has to do with the need to eradicate the matriarchal society and also eradicate the persistence of knowledge keepers, herbalists that were primarily women. And that continues to this very day by under-education, over-incarceration, and displacement of indigenous and Afro-Ecuadorian women, and relegating them to the periphery of the cities. And one of the alarming, I would say, facts that we found really troubling was the rate of femicide. And we know, and many feminist scholars, including bell hooks, that have argued already that when in the society of the oppressed, the rate of violence against women and children goes much higher. So there is a relationship between territorial injustices and economic oppressions, political oppressions on one hand, and the high rate of violence that is captured in the rate of femicide. We also started mapping histories of indigenous and Afro-indigenous resistance from early days, where you can see the kind of the herbalist, the knowledge of herbalism and plant knowledge is kind of transferred from one generation to another, secretly through midwifery, all the way to, you know, the labor disputes, uprising against state taxations, to basically some of the most promising indigenous movements in the 20th century, including, for instance, the work of Dolores Kakongo, that with Transito Amaguana found the first plurinational organization in Latin America titled the Ecuadorian Federation of Indigenous Peoples, and they were primarily focused on self-empowerment for indigenous people, self-determination, and solidarity among different nations. And this, of course, led to the first Pan-American gathering in Quito in 1990, also known as the Meeting of the Eagle and the Condor, in response to the quincentennial celebration of Christopher Columbus's arrival in 1992. And this meeting led to the draft of the first collective declaration known as the Declaration of Quito that clearly states demands of indigenous nations for territorial justice and political self-determination. And the uprising indigenous resistance continues to this day, whether it's through marches led by Waorani people or by kind of new methods of mapping and kind of counter cartographies created by co-funds to be able to kind of legally take control of their own territories. The historical one thing that we can see here throughout the entire timeline is the historical continuity of systemic dispossessions of indigenous people and the violence against land and people in a way. And this narrative, in a way, counters the naturalized and taken for granted state narratives by showing the relationship between indigenous peoples, waterways, and flora. But more importantly, it is also projective in a sense that it allows us to see an alternative world existing beyond and after capitalism, which may begin perhaps with on patenting and on naming of the stolen plant, its rematriation. This image, by the way, is taken by Pablo, and it's showing the blockade that was happening across indigenous territories around Quito during the pandemic. So basically they kind of blocked the roads to stop the penetration of kind of people from the outside, foreigners, and which would kind of increase the risk of sickness, but also kind of to kind of stop the arrival of missionaries. So, I mean, I would like to acknowledge that until the systemic, the systems and structures of dispossession and dehumanization, some of which we reviewed here are including gender violence, contradictory regional conservation measures, unchecked extraction infrastructures, scientific interventions, among others, are completely dismantled. The process of decolonization cannot happen here. We're over time. I just want to mention that in the links that I shared with you, you can see that this book project was part of an initiative that also included an exhibition, a traveling exhibition, and a number of collaborative projects. And it led to the writing of an open letter to Rem Koolhaas and the Guggenheim Museum Board of Directors with regards to a rather troubling installation of the countryside back in 2020, kind of curated by Rem Koolhaas and OMA. And I'd love to talk more about this in case we have more time. So we are on 45 minutes. I can open this for conversation and questions, or I can kind of elaborate more on any aspect of the project that you're interested in. Thank you.
Thank you, Ghazal. Thank you so much for this presentation. If I mean, I don't know how much more time you'd like to have. I think we could have 5 to 10 more minutes if you want. Our students have a couple of questions. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yes or no? There's at least 1 or 2 questions. I also have 1 question, but it's up to you.
Let's just start with questions, and if we have time, I can go back to the open letter. If not, it's not urgent.
Okay. Do you guys know who wants to ask a question? I can ask while you decide who's gonna formulate the question. Is that all right? Okay. Ghazal, thank you so much. I think you just shared with us a treasure trove in terms of a great example of counter mapping, and counter mapping or alternative mapping or critical cartography. Uh, it's something, I mean, for our students, it's something that I think that term was first discussed back in the mid-90s by Nancy Peluso. Very important seminal text, Whose Woods Are These? And Nancy Peluso, her background is in sociology, anthropography. And when we look at the history of counter mapping practices, we see that they have been mostly focused on anthropological, ethnographic, on revealing the oppression experienced by dispossessed groups with no representation. So I guess the way I'm starting to formulate this question would have to do with coming from design,
Mhm.
design practices as scientific practices, as botany or medicine, etc. Design has historically been also mobilized in terms of power structures that translate into design as an exclusionary practice. That's one of the things you address in No Design on Stolen Land, is the need to decolonialize design itself. And so my question for you is whether what's the role, what could be the role for design, if any at all, within the type of practice that you share with us today? Because some might say, well, this is great from a critical geography point of view, or it's a sort of history that foregrounds perhaps the spatial or the territorial aspects, but what does it have to do with design? And so the question is, what is the agency of design? How can it be reformulated or understood in a field of practice like the one you just shared with us, Ghazal?
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good question, because that's a question that is also a contemporary challenge for me, and it's always been asked since publication of the No Design on Stolen Land. So I don't believe in a kind of offering prescription for the whole field, but I can share with you what my take is on the question, which is personal and to some extent kind of informed by my own history as a displaced youth and currently living in exile, not being able to back to my home country, not being able to kind of connect with the indigenous communities that I belong to and not to the land that I belong to. So based on the way I see it is that we as designers are in a very powerful and unique position because our work is situated between the paper space of maps and drawings on one hand and material exploration on the ground. And 90% of what we're doing is happening on the paper. That in and of itself kind of tells you something, right? It's like, and if we take this representational aspect of empire very seriously and try to kind of fully understand it, try to understand its psychology, its purpose, its methods, its histories, not unlike Edward Said, then you realize that there is so much to do with the tools that we have and with the trainings that we have to offer when it comes to counter narratives, counter cartographies, counter representations. And so to me, I think the lead is in the details of how disposition happened. And let me just say that representation, in my opinion, is not just the space of maps and drawings. We can also think of them as kind of naturalize the standards and biases, naturalize the standards that are based on particular political biases and cultural beliefs that then find themselves in professional principles, right? It's like the most basic kind of professional principles that we have that we never question, standards and codes of practice. They are all based on a series of beliefs, right? Beliefs about nature with capital N, beliefs about the kind of the static nature in a way, which kind of formed the entire late 19th century and 20th century practice of urban planning and engineering, right? So these adjacent kind of disciplines. And then there is the built environment in and of itself. So the built environment is inherently political. I mean, I go back to the map of Quito that I shared with you. Like the first thing that these colonizers do is build a capital, right? And there's a really good kind of piece by Pierre Bélanger called Decolonization of Planning, where basically he explicitly mentions that once this colonial set of relationships and the settler colonial ambitions are manifested physically and spatially in the gridded system of city, then it's incredibly difficult to challenge it or move it, or let alone change it. Right. So the built environment in and of itself is yet another medium of representation, in my opinion. So not sure if I answered your question. Maybe we can, there are a number of techniques that I'm using in my own practice. These kind of counter narratives that are incredibly spatial and geospatial and material are on one side, and then we can start talking about how drawing can become an important research method and informs the way we do research. That's another topic in and of itself that perhaps I mean, we can discuss further if you like.
Well, if you know, if you could further elaborate on, I guess, the main difference between cartography and design is that design, besides being critical, it tends to be projective, right? Like if we have something under the label of a design practice, I think that the expectation of the audience will be that there will be a proposal at the end. And here, I think that there's a proposal but it's not in terms of being normative, but in terms of how the history itself, how the narrative is resituated. I think that perhaps could be seen as the projective moment of a counter mapping project like this. I don't know if that is that a reading that you would agree, or do you think that you simply can do without a propositive or a projective moment, or that perhaps the projective moment is precisely the more problematic when we talk about conventional design practices? What would you say about the projective?
Well, I think your reading of this counter narrative being projective is absolutely apt. I mean, there is a proposal here, right? So there is a proposal. At least there is kind of an initial step that can potentially be explored to contribute to the collective process of decolonization. And in this particular project, it has been focused on patenting and on naming of the plant. Why don't we start from there? We also mention the significance of unbuilding in no design on stolen land. And I think there is a lot of projective projects to be done when you think of it. I personally don't buy kind of the innovation ethos of many design practices that come with blueprint, come to you with blueprint. I don't necessarily see them as innovative. Innovation, in my mind, is one that can lead to a radical cultural and political change. And sometimes this radical cultural and political change, dissidence and separating oneself from the mainstream, can be guided by history of those practices that have been systemically marginalized and kept out of the disciplinary canon, right? So newness is something that we can also find in timelessness of indigenous practices, timelessness of women's botanical knowledge.
Great, thank you, Ghazal. Questions from our students or any audience member? Lorenza is in our seminar. She's our only landscape architect, so we're very happy to have her share a comment with us. Go ahead, Lorenza.
Hello. So my question, well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your project with us. I found it very, very interesting. And also I would like to comment, I think Mexico has a lot of similar history of extraction and dispossession of communities. And on a more personal note, I've seen what sort of big residential and commercial development that is fueled only or primarily by profit have affected rural communities and also urban communities in a way by gentrification, but more rural communities. These big developments come in, they take their water resource, they modify the landscape, and end up by displacing people altogether. So I was kind of wondering if you have any insights on how we can tackle development in a way that doesn't reproduce this narrative. Is there sort of like an alternative to this? And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
I think first we need to question development. And development, I mean, if building new projects actually means development in terms of like humanitarian environmental values. P. Rangon, I forgot her first name, is an Indian scholar who's written a really nice piece. It's called Development in Question. I highly recommend reading it. And it kind of shows the history of development in the 20th century post World War II. And basically it puts into question both the notion of development, but also kind of this unquestioned belief in economic development through building and construction. Based on what I have learned from this project and also working on on the history of my own homeland, I see a major problem in sovereignty and systems of political governance with the establishment of nation states or kind of centralization of administration and control over politics and the so-called resource management within a state institutions. Because traditionally, the body of governance and was within people, native people that have been living on these waters, have been living on the land. And so there was a sense of responsibility and stewardship associated with methods of landscape praxis, building and non-building, but at the same time, kind of taking care of flora and fauna and rivers and the soil. Because their life depended on it. They could kind of visibly see it. But when all decisions are centralized in nation states, then all of a sudden, what does this mean? I mean, this nation states, if it becomes kind of a rentier states whose primary responsibility is opening up these indigenous territories, rural territories, the so-called countryside, to exploitation for kind of global trade or for kind of urban economies, then we have a major problem here. So I see this primarily as a political issue, and that cannot be answered by kind of proposing alternative architectural methods or kind of ethical measures introduced to the field of design, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? No. Ghazal. Oh, Armando. It's difficult when it's a hybrid thing, and I'm sorry, Ghazal. I just asked the students to turn on their cameras. I know it's hard to speak to a blank screen.
No, it seems very smooth on my end. I mean.
Okay, great. Armando, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation and congratulations for your project. I just wanted to ask if there's any lineage or that you know, or is there any transference of the idea of comfort in terms of like you know, when I was watching your presentation and how the plan had gone through, you know, by the systems of power to different countries and so on, and seeing the photograph of this person with you know, in the center of a plantation, I suppose it was, like a white male guy, and I was thinking of how sort of the ideas of what is comfort has been transferred from structures of power to communities, and to what extent sort of like the system of values that of course I mean, the Lorenza's question was about development and profit, which is part of the equation. But also I was thinking in terms of the search for comfort in being in a space, to what extent that understanding has been transferred also through structures of power and colonization to communities that were sort of receivers of that colonizing. Yes, basically. With regards to their relationship with their own land and sort of the conditions that they are living in terms of humidity, temperature, sense of relationship to the elements they're living in.
Armando, I'm not sure if I understand your question. Environmental comfort?
Correct. In terms of like, there's these colonizers that come into a land, right? And with a different set of values of what being in a land means. I don't know, somebody coming from a colder country and with a different kind of experience of the environment comes to another place where people are living in another relationship with their own environment and land. And though that kind of value of what is the sort of level of, yeah, I can't find any other word, comfort in relation to their own environment would shift by a structure of power of a colonizing sort of foreign entity, you know. Would that like change the way people living in the, you know, in the places where they are receiving these colonizers would shift their sense of relationship with the environment that they're living in?
I don't think I can answer to that question. I mean, I get it now, but I don't have a response to it because it's not something that I've been personally kind of curious about, if that makes sense. What I see, however, is that basically when it comes to climate and biodiversity, these regions, the tropical regions, are on one hand, in a way, demonized and kind of rendered in this really dark image. And as we have seen in some of the quotes that I mentioned, kind of the indigenous cultures are equated with savagery and backwardness. And at the same time, these are these kind of regions that are being currently exploited primarily because of partly because of their climate condition. Like think about Ecuador and Colombia, for instance. I mean, the cinchona plantations are now replaced by cod flower plantations. Acre after acre after acre, because these are like some of the largest exporters of cod flowers, primarily because of the year-round climate condition. I mean, comfort becomes important for someone or an entity who's kind of thinking of staying in one place. What I see is basically exploitation, extraction, and then move. Like, it's no sense of responsibility or kind of continuity, unless it's like continuity in terms of moving from one mode of exploitation to another. So I think there is a great deal of awareness among indigenous activists and scholars when it comes to the significance and importance of reviving indigenous worldviews, modes of livelihood, and kind of self-determination. And that's very optimistic when for South America. We haven't seen any movement that has led to a radical political shift. Chile was kind of promising a couple of years ago, but I don't know what's happening there. But yeah, I mean, in terms of comfort and climate, I think it's like what I've been studying is like how these climate regions are being seen in a very particular way, exalted naturalist narratives, and then exploited for the economic profiteering opportunities they offer.
Sorry, my second part of the question is I would be very interested in listening your open letter to the exhibition.
I can share
if there's any time, if there's time.
Yeah. I can share the link with you because it's long. I can't read the whole thing, but basically there is a quote on the wall. There's a writing on the wall that kind of assumes this neutral kind of reflection on history of conservation, and basically it proposes two different ways forward. One way being one of them is proposing that the moderns should become indigenous again, and this becomes really kind of problematic when you place it within the history of indigenous exploitation, not only territorial injustices, but taking away a kind of the indigenous knowledge and extra kind of pushing aside indigenous worldviews, that all of a sudden you recognize that, oh, we fucked up the world, everything we've destroyed everything, and now why don't we just like become indigenous to our land? So the open letter is kind of introducing in a very nuanced and layered way how this self-indigenization is in a way cultural appropriation and is continuation of indigenous dispossession. It's asking basically the Guggenheim Board of Directors and Everyone Cool House to respond, which they didn't. So
Nice. Thank you.
Ghazal, we have, I think, at least one more question from one of our students. Paulina, feel free. And I don't know, Ghazal, please let us know whenever you need to go. We can.
I have time.
Paulina.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for your presentation also. And my question goes around the academy, taking the premise of that the academy is a place where the dynamics of power and domination continue to be reproduced, and the approach to design is based on appropriation and colonialization. My question is, it is possible to imagine new forms of teaching? And if so, do you imagine a new way of teaching, or how have you approached to combating these dynamics from a teaching perspective?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's a challenge, right? And I think when we're talking about counter-representation as an important tool of creating radical cultural transformation and radical political transformation, education becomes incredibly important. As an educator in academia, I've been questioning the scale and scope of impact. So one thing that becomes really important for me, and one of the major reasons why we were doing this project in multimedia format, and that the fact that the book was written for the general public comes from the fact that the academic audience or scholarly audience is very limited, and our audience actually is situated outside of this cadre, right? So in a way, these projects are trying to expand the educational purpose, right? There's an educational component to it. It is possible to bring in alternative worldviews, but that in and of itself is not necessarily enough, and we cannot call it decolonization as many people do, because as Eve Tuck has discussed very eloquently, decolonization ultimately goes back to land and giving land back. And so metaphors, posturings, lectures, none of this can be called decolonization if it doesn't lead to serious kind of tangible material changes on the ground.
That's a great point, Ghazal. And I think the last question that was just submitted via text is a nice segue, or dovetails nicely with what you just said. The question is whether you know of good urban planning practices in relation to this topic, whether you know of countries or cities where the political climate in terms of colonialism is more sensible or open to a different approach towards planning.
Mm-hmm. I can't think of anything right now, but think of it this way. I mean, we're talking about decolonization, the process of decolonization. It is a transgenerational process. It's a long game. And sometimes I think that we should keep in mind that this long game also needs us to pay attention to urgent conditions, to the problem of survival today, tomorrow, because I mean, if you don't pay attention to that, then there is no future. So I always think of the significance of being able to work in two different time scales. One, like these kind of counter narratives and big projects that are aimed for transgenerational change, and then other types of projects that kind of recognize the urgency of grave situations on the ground and try to at least kind of cut the transgenerational trauma right now to some degree. So in that sense, when you think about it that way, then all of a sudden, a lot of practices and projects that are socially conscious and that they're invested in social and environmental justice become relevant. Because no project that is serving justice and community empowerment and self-determination is too small, in my opinion.
Well, Ghazal, thank you so much. We don't have any more questions, and I think that's a great question to finish. We really want to thank you for your time. The open letter, we would be more than happy to share it with our students and to include it as part of this recording when we upload it to our YouTube channel. I would like to thank everyone for being here, people who accompanied us online. And I just want to say, I'm gonna stop the recording now, but for the record, I want to say that I do want to follow up with you on the potential project of publishing your work in Mexico through the National University. Thank you so much, Ghazal.
Thank you. So Danny, I just wanted to mention that I shared the link to the open letter and also shared to our project webpage in chat, just in case students are interested in. Thank you so much for your invitation, and thank you for your good questions and kind of indulging me.
Thank you so much, Ghazal. A good round of applause.
They continue. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.